Everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here. Obviously traveling if you like my hotel art in my hotel room, but that's not why we're here. Today, we are going to be talking about the United States because, quite frankly, the privacy standards in the U.S. are fundamentally changing. And I am going to go through my default preamble. You've probably heard it a million times if you're a longtime follower, and that is cybersecurity and privacy are agnostic to politics, but we're not immune from it. Privacy is a human right. And the problem that the United States has is that many of the standards and practices we have in terms of legal framework for privacy rights in the modern era actually stem from the Reagan era in the 1980s. We've had some tweaks since then, but fundamentally, we are behind a lot of other countries. And two stories have come to light in the last 24 to 48 hours that, quite frankly, really underscore the problem that we have is we as citizens basically have a human right for privacy against the government and everything else. And that is fundamental. I don't care who's in power. If it's a Democrat, we should have that same right. If it's a Republican, we should have that same right. And so with that, let's dive in because these two stories, I think, quite frankly, are telling as to why we need better laws here in the United States, and also fundamentally how I think privacy laws are weakening. So the first basically story I want to talk about is entitled Privacy and Hunger Groups Sue Over USDA Attempt to Collect Personal Data of SNAP Recipients. Now, here's what's going on with this, because privacy and hunger relief groups and also a handful of plaintiffs that are receiving food assistance benefits are now suing the federal government over the Trump administration's attempts to collect the personal information of millions of U.S. residents who use SNAP, or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And I will get to the logic behind this very shortly here. But the lawsuit filed in Washington, D.C. this past Thursday said that the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or USDA, violated federal privacy laws when it ordered states and vendors to turn over 5 years of data about food assistance programs applicants and enrollees, including their names, birth dates, personal addresses, and social security numbers. The lawsuit, quote, seeks to ensure that the government is not exploiting our most vulnerable citizens by disregarding longstanding privacy protections, end quote. That is according to the National Student Legal Defense Network's attorney, Daniel Zeibel, writing in the complaint. The Electronic Privacy Information Center and Amazon Inc., which is a Jewish response to hunger, basically joined the four food assistance recipients in bringing this lawsuit. The White House did not respond. And quite frankly, yes, this is one of those things that for years or decades even, most people on both sides of the aisle, both Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, have essentially said, we don't want necessarily a centralized database of all of us. It's bad enough we have Social Security as a de facto national ID, but we don't want any kind of national ID. And when you were talking about people that would be on essentially a nutrition program, these are the kinds of people that are not going to be able to afford high-priced lawyers to basically fight for them in the legal system and all of that. It's quite frankly a difficult position to be in. And if we do have privacy rights and the states have been managing this, so for example, I live in Illinois. We have a SNAP program here, also something called WIC cards, all this kind of stuff, basically that is administered by the state. Why should the federal government get involved in this? Now, you can make the issue of, well, they're looking for fraud, but quite frankly, every state has fraud regulators, and fraud is oftentimes found and it is killed. And for the record, detection of any kind of crime, whether it's fraud or anything else, is always retroactive. The federal government would be no different in this position. And we've also seen reports come out that said, well, the fraud that was alleged during basically the campaign in 2024 is simply not materializing. We have inspector generals, we have all of these other things. I'm not going to argue the point. I don't care if you love or hate the president. I don't care if you love or hate this administration. The point is that we have a right to privacy. And so I don't care if you're a billionaire, or I don't care if you're a thousandaire, or I don't care if you're on food stamps. Quite frankly, we all have that right to privacy. Now, the other story that came to light in the last couple of days as well is entitled Federal Judge Blocks Trump Administration's Firing of 2 Democratic Members of Privacy Oversight Board. Now, this is an interesting one, and I want to give you both sides of the argument here. So, here's what happened. A federal judge blocked President Trump's firing of 2 Democratic members of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. Now, the ruling this past Wednesday from U.S. District Court Reggie B. Walton ends a lawsuit brought by 2 of the 3 fired board members this past February. Now, this is a 5-member board, which is an independent watchdog housed within the executive branch. Typically, similar to the FCC, the way this works is that you're going to have 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and then whoever the president is going to appoint the chair, who is usually the basically from that party. So the Democratic president would basically appoint a Democrat to the chair, Republican president, Republican. So with that, if you didn't know, Congress actually created this agency after the September 11th attacks and essentially tasked the board members with making sure that the federal government's counterterrorism policies are balanced against our privacy and civil liberties. In other words, they are, even under the executive branch, supposed to be sitting independent of the president, of everybody, to basically point out when somebody overreaches, whether it's the president signing an executive order that oversteps or steps on our civil liberties, doesn't matter who the president is, or Congress. Whoever runs Congress, it doesn't matter. But if they overstep, this is the board that has that kind of oversight to essentially look at this. So with that, obviously, the White House responded. And so spokesperson Harrison Fields wrote in an email to the Associated Press, and I quote, "The Constitution gives President Trump the power to remove personnel who exercise his executive authority. The Trump administration looks forward to ultimate victory on this issue," end quote. And for the record, that is true. Essentially, what we have here is what's called mutual toleration and forbearance. Essentially, we have unwritten rules of the government of how frameworks are supposed to run. In this case, a board having oversight composed of both sides of the political aisle typically is independent. And that unwritten rule essentially is that if a board has oversight or is chaired in this way, we don't arbitrarily fire them without cause. And so no cause, for the record, has been given. And Judge Walton said in his written ruling that allowing an at-will removal of the board of board members by the president would make the board, quote, "beholden to the very authority it is supposed to oversee on behalf of Congress and the American people," end quote. In other words, you've got basically an entity that has oversight on a president, and so the president shouldn't be able to fire them. And while that is not a written rule, again, the mutual toleration of both sides understand that the loyal opposition when they're out of power, and forbearance, meaning you're going to play by those unwritten rules, not play constitutional hardball, is the name of the game. Because what happens is somebody punches, somebody comes back with a knife. The person comes back with a knife, the other person comes back with a gun, et cetera, et cetera. It's an escalating problem that we have. And so these things are quite frankly an issue, which is why now the judicial branch is getting into play to essentially say, no, this is not going to happen because they're interpreting the actual laws and composition of this board. Now, the judge also said that even though the statute creating the board didn't include any specific protections from at-will removal of board members, as I mentioned, the basic structure and function of the board showed that Congress's intent was to restrict the president's power to fire board members. In other words, if you're putting an oversight position basically against the executive branch, then the executive branch shouldn't be able to fire the oversight. In the same way, the oversight positions on the legislative or the judicial should not be able to be fired by the legislative or judicial branches, respectively. This is essentially critical to the fundamental understanding of separation of powers in the United States. This is something, unfortunately, that most of the general public, has not been educated on. And so by virtue of that, here we are, and studies bear that out. Feel free to Google that. So I'll leave you with that. But this really, I think, speaks to the privacy rights that we have. If we are firing the watchdogs or we are trying to collect information, rather the federal government is trying to do these things, then that is constitutionally overstepping our rights to privacy. Now, you may see, or you may say rather, and I've gotten actual emails on this as a result of my radio show, that, well, Nick, it does not say in the Constitution directly that we have a right to privacy. And the answer is, but the Supreme Court has. And what is the Supreme Court? The Supreme Court is the final decision on the interpretation of constitutional law, which means if the Supreme Court rules we have a right to privacy, which they've said over and over and over in multiple rulings, then we have a right to privacy per the Constitution. And so it's an argument I've heard over and over. And so quite frankly, I'm kind of sick of it because I've answered a lot of those emails over the years from radio show listeners that simply just did not understand that concept. So with that, now I'll leave you with this. Best of luck to us all, but the last thing I want to see is our constitutional rights eroded, and I think you would agree too, no matter who you are or what you believe or what side of the political aisle you're on. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at Nick AESP, and please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please, 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 stay private and secure. Take care.